Who's better, Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton? Yeah, that's right, my YouTube F1 career hasn't even started yet, and I'm deciding to end it before it ever does. This is without doubt one of the most asked questions in F1 at the moment, and it's also one of the most complex. And so if you're going to watch this video, you have to hereby promise that you're not going to go down into the comments and comment anything negative about what I'm about to say. Who am I kidding? You're going to do it anyway. And also stick by to the end of the video, because my opinion at the end is very different to what you might think it is. First off, if you live under a rock, who are they? Well, Lewis Hamilton is the most accomplished F1 driver with the most race wins in history. However, he hasn't yet earned the title of the most championship wins in history, as he's currently drawn with F1 legend Michael Schumacher. Lewis is one of the most experienced drivers on the grid, but that also means he's getting quite old. So if he wants to win his 8th championship to secure the title for most driver championships, he's gonna have to get on it pretty soon. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen is a rookie to winning championships, winning his first championship last year in the most watched season of F1 ever. But this also means that he has a lot of fans. And he's currently well on his way to winning his 2nd year with pretty much no chance of anyone opposing him, which you can find everything you need to know about that in my latest video here. The debate about which of these two drivers is better came about mostly last year as their rivalry reached its peak. Over the entire year, the two had many encounters in one of the closest years in F1. At Silverstone, we saw the famous attempted murder of Max Verstappen when at Cops, Lewis Hamilton didn't give the space he should have to Max, leading to their wheels being clipped and sending Max flying into the wall, and then later on flying to hospital. But not being one to be outdone, at Monza, Max retaliated by mounting Lewis's car, almost killing him if it wasn't for the halo. And once again, remember our agreement. You watch this far, you can't get mad at me for what I say. This was joined by a year of back and forth as to who won each race, and an immensely amusing Azerbaijan where Max took himself out, and then after a red flag to deal with his car and a restart, Lewis just drove straight off the track at the first corner. And with that race, we saw the first time that Drive to Survive didn't need to fake something to make it more interesting, but you best believe they did it anyway. This all led up to the finale of the year, Abu Dhabi. Going into the race, both drivers were drawn with 369.5 points each, truly phenomenal. And after 95% of the race, Lewis Hamilton was in the lead. But then Latifi decided he was going to practice his new 2022 driving style a bit early and crashed into a wall, causing a yellow flag. And I'm not here to debate the rights and wrongs of this, but Michael Massey decided at the last minute to allow the lapped cars that were between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton to pass Lewis, leaving Max right behind Lewis, with the race set to start with 1 lap left. And after a hard defended first place, Hamilton's worn tyres were no match for Verstappen's fresh tyres, leaving the championship win to Max. And whilst it was definitely probably the most controversial final to an F1 season, it was also the most entertaining to watch. But none of that answers who is the better driver, so how do we answer that? Well, there's a few ways. And the first way is with history, and this is a pretty simple answer. Lewis wins. He's won the most races, he's won more championships, he's just straight winning, apart from last year. But at the same time, Max has had less time in the sport than Lewis, 7 years to Lewis's 15, which if you can count is a difference of 8, meaning Max could theoretically get 8 more wins by the time he's at Lewis's current level of experience. But then again, Lewis's first championship win was in his 2nd year in the sport. It took Max 6 years. But all of that is pedantics. Historically, Lewis is better. But what about now? Well, this is much harder to answer. A lot more goes into F1 than just how good a driver is, and this year has shown that more than most. Lewis Hamilton, after losing last year, came off a 4-year win streak, and in this year there's pretty much a 0% chance he could ever win. The Mercedes car just hasn't been good enough with the new specifications that were added between this year and last. Meanwhile, Red Bull has built an absolutely phenomenal car that is only slightly matched by the Ferrari, but they have more problems than just a car. However, over the year, Mercedes has been upgrading their car, and over the past few races, the podiums have seen a massive increase of Lewis Hamilton's face. And it's pretty unlikely that based off of that, Lewis won't get at least one first-place victory in a race this year. But there lies the issue. How do you compare two drivers who aren't on the same team, driving the same car with the same strategist? Well, you can't, and for the most part, we'll need time to be able to tell who is the better driver. Now, this is controversial opinion time, but at this point in time, I would say that Lewis Hamilton is the better driver. He's more experienced, he's had more impressive drives, and altogether he just seems a bit more consistent. But Max Verstappen is proving himself to be a worthy rival. This season he's been practically untouchable by anyone else on the grid. Between him and his car, he is faster and better than any of the other drivers on the current grid, and he seems to just be getting better and better. At this point, it's seeming more and more possible for him to beat Sebastian Vettel's previously untouchable record of 9 race wins in a row. But time and the rest of the season will be the deciding factor in that. And now that we're in the midpoint of the video, I just want to stress, I have no no preference between Lewis or Max. I am fully aware that they're both amazing drivers and that they've both also done quite questionable things to win races. But at the same time, I don't actually like either of them. Between having a driver who wins most of the time not being very interesting for the championship and the fact that they're both pretty unlikable, I have no preference for either. But that's my opinion. Like them if you want and don't get angry at me in the comments. But if you do go down there, make sure to click the subscribe button. But at this point, I'd also like to mention that many would argue that historically, Lewis Hamilton isn't even the best driver, but Michael Schumacher is. And he truly was a god of his time, having the same 7 championship wins as Lewis and only just being overtaken in the most race wins. Michael Schumacher's legacy is not one to be excluded from this video. And another argument to be made is that F1 has become much safer over the years. A few decades ago, drivers accepted that it was likely that a fellow driver or themselves could die in any given season, but now it would be a shock. It's been over 8 years since the last death of Jules Bianchi, and before that it was Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger in 1994, and even worse, they both died on the same weekend. And that's not to say that F1 is a completely safe sport now where drivers don't have to worry about injury or worse death. Zhou Guanyu at Silverstone this year, Lewis at Monza last year, or Max at Silverstone again is proof that we're likely not that far off the next major racing incident. But since Schumacher's day, things like better designed cars, the halo, and tighter restrictions on what's classed as safe enough for racing has led to the chance of death decreasing drastically. There's also a lot more going on in F1 cars that helps drivers. Even paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheels are relatively new, only coming in the early 90s, and before that it wasn't uncommon for drivers' hands to be cut or blistered from excessive use of a gear stick during a race. But other things have come in to help drivers. As racing's got more competitive and better funded, teams have, well, full teams behind them to analyze all the data from the cars and the other cars to make the best, or in Ferrari's case, the worst decisions. The skill behind being a racing driver has shifted from speed, strategy, safety, and more to mostly just speed. So what I'm trying to say is Michael Schumacher had a lot more things to deal with 10 to 30 years ago than Lewis has now. Plus, the tracks are ever evolving, usually with the intention of being safer, leading to wider corners and tracks with less complex hairpins and chicanes. Lewis Hamilton is currently only slightly ahead of Michael Schumacher's race wins, and he's currently not adding much to the difference. So it's pretty safe to say at this current point in time, historically, Michael Schumacher might still just have that edge on Lewis Hamilton. Another point to mention is that there are way more races in a year right now than there have been before. In the 80s and 90s, there was an average of 16 races a year, steadily rising in the early 2000s, but never passing 20 until the year Schumacher retired in 2012. And apart from the year of COVID, no year has seen less than 20 races since 2016. All of this means that Lewis Hamilton has had more opportunity to claim race wins than Schumacher ever did. And you might want to argue that Schumacher had a longer career than Lewis, but Lewis has nearly caught up, only being 2 years behind Schumacher. Plus, Schumacher didn't get a race win in his post-mini retirement years with Mercedes, making their time and years in the sport pretty equal. But at the same time, Lewis did beat the previous record whilst having nearly 20 less races entered in his career. So all in all, in my opinion, remember the comment rule, Michael Schumacher is still just about deserving of his title of best driver of all time. But with another good year or two, Lewis could once and for all dethrone him. Meanwhile, we might have to wait another decade to get the final say as to whether Max Verstappen is the best driver, but I would say in this year, Max is clearly the better driver. His current season is phenomenal and he seems to have improved massively in his racecraft. But the best thing we can all wish for is next year we see the return of Mercedes and we can have another title fight that is as fun to watch as last year's. Now, this is a stupid question before I ask it, but do you think I'm wrong? Let me know in the comments down below. You have my permission, but don't get angry at me, like I said. Anyway, other than that, that's it for this video, and I'll see you next time.